This joint hearing will now come to order. I want to welcome all of our distinguished panelists, and I'll have an opportunity to introduce you individually as we proceed forward. But I will make a few opening remarks and then recognize my colleagues. In early 2009, the U.S.-Russian relationship was at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. The Obama administration came to office with a conviction that an improved bilateral relationship was essential to our national security. And after both countries hit the so-called reset button in February of 2009, some significant and important developments occurred in both tone and substance in the bilateral relationship. Let me put forth some examples. First, as a result of Russian cooperation, in less than a year, 20,000 American troops headed for Afghanistan have either traveled through Russia or over Russian airspace, saving the American taxpayers some $133 million. Secretary of State for Political Affairs Bill Burns recently observed, and these are his words, Russia is becoming a much more active operational partner in a collective effort to help stabilize Afghanistan and prevent violent extremism to regain a platform there. As to the issue of a nuclear-armed Iran, there has been a shift in the Russian position regarding sanctions. It's no longer a question if sanctions should be imposed, but a question of what form they should take. In the aftermath of the July summit in Moscow, both presidents agreed to form the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission. This commission, with 16 working groups, is dedicated to dealing with issues ranging from energy, terrorism, drug trafficking, science and technology, education, and cultural exchanges, and much more. Their work is progressing, and reports are expected by the end of the summer. Most importantly, on April 8th in Prague, Czechoslovakia, the U.S. and Russia signed an historic nuclear arms reduction treaty, slashing the number of strategic nuclear warheads by 1/3. This New START agreement signifies a substantial change in the relationship and demonstrates to the non-nuclear world that both Russia and the United States are committed to advancing the cause of nuclear non-proliferation. Furthermore, it's important to note that the reset of this relationship is not limited to official governmental actions, but has impacted Russian attitudes towards the United States. In early 2009, only 38% of the Russian population had a positive attitude towards the United States. A year later, that number has increased by 16%. Now, some 54% of the Russian people have a favorable view of the United States. So yes, it's my opinion that the bilateral relationship has improved in many ways. And it's my own belief that it's imperative to our national security to sustain this momentum, because we can't forget that the United States and Russia possess 96% of the world's nuclear weapons. So if for no other reason, this reality makes this a most critical bilateral relationship and should underscore the need to sustain and enhance the positive trends that have developed over the course of the past year. Now, I'm not naive, and I recognize that there are and remain disagreements and contentious issues between us that need to be addressed. And I'm sure there will be hearings and other occasions and other venues to discuss those. But one of the most obvious irritants in the bilateral relationship from the Russian perspective is the continued application to Russia of Section 402 of the Trade Act of 1974, the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The amendment imposed trade restrictions on those countries who denied its citizens the right of freedom of immigration. The genesis of the amendment was the Soviet Union's refusal to allow Soviet Jews to travel overseas. But the reality is that Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, has fully complied with the amendment's requirements as concluded by a presidential compliance determination since 1994, 16 years ago. And yet Congress has failed to graduate Russia from the amendment. Ironically, Russia and Israel recently implemented a visa-free travel program for their citizens traveling between their countries. It was implemented just this past Saturday. This program eliminates the Byzantine process of filling out the extensive Russian visa application and then navigating the Russian bureaucracy. It would appear that Russia and Israel enjoy a special relationship. It's interesting to note that neither Israel nor Russia are participants in our visa waiver program. So I believe we should take the advice of the co-author of this amendment, the late Congressman Charles Vanik, who stated in 1989, and again, these are his words, the Soviet Union has freed up immigration to the point that it makes sense to waive the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and restore normal trade tariff conditions to Moscow. I would submit that it is time for the United States Congress to act. And we do have a precedent for graduating countries from Jackson-Vanik. For example, even though China remains a communist country today, in 1999, Congress graduated them from all aspects of Title IV of the 1974 Trade Act, paving the way for China's accession to the WTO, and yet Russia has not acceded to the WTO after filing its application back in the early 1990s. As I said, Russia has satisfied the requirements articulated by the amendment, and we should not move the goalposts and ask for further concessions that are irrelevant to the amendment. Changing the rules of the game seriously, I believe, undermines our credibility and breeds resentment that affects the relationship in our own bona fides as a potential partner. not only would graduating Russia bring economic and commercial benefits, encouraging American companies to increase investments in Russia, but it will also send a clear and distinct message to the Russian people that the United States is serious on forging a more dynamic and cohesive partnership. I look forward to the testimony from today's witnesses. And now let me turn to my friend and ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Gallagher, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing today to look at the possibility of repealing Jackson-Vanik Amendment as it applies to Russia. I would also like to welcome and thank the 6 witnesses that are here today and participating in this hearing. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was enacted into law with the intention of protecting the rights of Jews attempting to immigrate from the former Soviet Union in the 1970s. The amendment removed most favored nation trade status until Russia was in full compliance with a free immigration policy. And every year since 1994, U.S. presidents have declared Russia to be in compliance in terms of freedom of immigration. This awards Russia what is now normal trade relation status. Jackson-Vanik is effectively not applied to Russia as long as their compliance with immigration standards does not change. However, the continued existence of Jackson-Vanik impacts the U.S. trade relationship with Russia, and Russia prepares for membership in the World Trade Organization. Without the repeal of Jackson-Vanik for Russia, the United States will be forced to opt out of the WTO obligation toward Russia, and because of the conditions placed on Russia NTR status as a result of Jackson-Vanik. As we consider lifting Jackson-Vanik, it's important to note that although the trade relationship between Russia and the United States has grown significantly in recent years, there are still outstanding issues. The most notable is the failure of Russian authorities to adequately enforce intellectual property rights. In addition, there remain high tariffs in place on cars, sports utility vehicles that are imported to the United States, as well as issues related to the importation of beef and poultry into Russia. As Congress and the Obama administration considers lifting Jackson-Vanik, I believe it's imperative that all of these trade issues be resolved. Further, it's my belief that our trade policy toward Russia would be viewed in the larger context of our overall bilateral relationship. The U.S. has many critical national interests that are profoundly impacted by our relations with Russia, including, most importantly, our effort to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. In addition, the U.S. is seeking strong Russian cooperation in the war against international terrorism and preventing terrorist groups from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. We also have strong interest in the evolution of Russia's own political system, its respect for human rights, and its relations with its neighbors. Therefore, I look forward to listening to the witnesses today on the impact of Jackson-Vanik on our trade relationship and on the U.S. national security priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Elton, and I'm going to go first to the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Trade and Nuclear Proliferation, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to be with you again on this important hearing. And obviously, with the end of the Cold War, Russia is no longer the looming threat it once was to us, and neither are we the looming threat that we once were to Russia. Quite the contrary, we have the potential now of developing one of the great partnerships in the history of civilization, particularly in addressing the security and economic challenges facing the world, no matter whether it is the procurement and the safety and the nuclear weapons, ending nonproliferation, the hot spots of dealing with Iran, our relations with China, keeping weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons out of the hands of terrorists. Wherever we are in dealing with security of the world, Russia and the United States loom as great necessary partners. But in order to achieve the maximum level of cooperation, it is vitally important that we set aside broad philosophical difference, some that still linger, and shrug off the last vestige of this Cold War. Our subcommittee must approach today's topic with recognition of the delicate balance necessary to promote America's best interest abroad. And we must promote a trade policy that encourages the responsible growth of American business here at home and abroad, but never at the expense of three things: never at the expense of our national security, nor in the face of egregious and appalling human rights violations abroad, and nor at the cost of the American workers here at home. Those are the three pillars of things we must not do. But as the global markets recover and rebuild, we are presented with the fortuitous opportunity of recognizing the mistakes of the past and strengthening America's status as the prime engine of global economic development. We must encourage a rising tide where economic growth coincides with increased living standards and greater democracy. And we must dominate or eliminate technical barriers to trade and tariffs on U.S. goods. And we must protect intellectual property as well as human rights and the rights of labor. And so as we gather here today, I think the fundamental question that we have before us was best phrased a few centuries ago by our good friend William Shakespeare, who said, "To be or not to be, that is the question. To have Jackson-Vanik or not have Jackson-Vanik, that is the question before us today. What would be the impact if we have it? What's the impact if we remove it in terms of our Russian relations?" And then finally, I think we have another opportunity to, in the words of the great Humphrey Bogart, from the movie Casablanca, as the movie ends, if you recall, he puts his arm around the captain and he says, "Louis, I think we have the beginning of a wonderful friendship." That's what we have here in the possibilities with Russia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for his eloquence and his remembering that great American, Humphrey Bogart. And with that, let me go to the ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jackson-Vanik helped millions by promoting freedom of emigration and other freedoms. It's indelibly written into the history of U.S.-Soviet relations. To ask whether it's useful is no slight to its great legacy. Some argue that Jackson-Vanik's continued application to Russia is a major diplomatic impediment. It impedes cooperation on Iran policy, some say. That's an oversell. Russia, unfortunately, appears determined to accommodate Iran, a policy that will eventually bite it, Jackson-Vanik or not. On the other hand, I don't see Russia's bad Iran policy or our other foreign policy and trade concerns with Moscow as strong reasons to maintain Jackson-Vanik. This legislation addresses specific circumstances. And fortunately, while Russia suffers many human rights problems this administration is largely silent on, there is freedom to emigrate from Russia. When it comes to big disputes, and we have several with Russia, I don't see Jackson-Vanik as much of a chit. Jackson-Vanik could be maintained while continuing to determine that Russia isn't impeding emigration, as it has been done for 16 years. But there's something to recognize, there's something of advantage here in us recognizing that this area has improved and put Russia with almost every other country that isn't subject to Jackson-Vanik, including repressive China. Russians, including Russian Democrats, resent being targeted by this annual review, especially when some in Congress link Jackson-Vanik's status to unrelated issues that can be addressed differently. Linking Jackson-Vanik to poultry trade disputes, for example, can't strengthen our ability to push human rights in Russia. I look forward to hearing the wide range of views here today, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this hearing.
I thank the gentleman, and now my other colleague from California, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, you're surrounded by Californians. There is no more fortunate position to be in.
Well,
I'm afraid I'm...
Hudson.
From the left coast.
Yes. In any case, I'm a little less enthusiastic about repealing Jackson-Vanik or failing to apply it in the manner that has prevented Russia from joining the WTO. That doesn't mean I couldn't reach that conclusion. It's just I lack the bubbling enthusiasm of some of my colleagues. I do not think that we have seen a real reset in our relationship with Russia. It is true that in supplying Afghanistan, we can fly over their airspace, but we have air bases in newly independent former Soviet republics which are critical to dealing with Afghanistan and which Russia tries to undermine and expel at every turn. And while Russia may eventually reluctantly agree to some sort of sanctions on Iran at the United Nations, you can be sure that they will be so tiny as to have no meaningful effect on Iran's economy, let alone any meaningful possibility of causing Iran to change its nuclear policy. We entered into the START, where we've concluded the START negotiations. Doing so was perhaps good for the world. It also was a chance for Russia to stand side by side with the United States as co-equal world superpowers, a honor that they don't enjoy near as often as they did before the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, I believe that the only way we can really improve Russia's behavior is by offering concessions and obtain on things that Russia really cares about. Jackson-Vanik is just one of the many things that we could offer. Now, I'm a man of faith, but I do not believe in a faith-based foreign policy. When it comes to making concessions to Russia, whether it be Jackson-Vanik or anything else, we should trust but verify. More particularly, we should get explicit, sometimes private, but at least explicit, clear agreements for meaningful steps taken by Russia in return for the steps taken by the United States. Now, high-level Russian diplomats have repeatedly requested a change, that we, quote, graduate them from Jackson-Vanik or eliminate Jackson-Vanik. Whichever device is used would be the same for Russia. They have described it as notorious in the Russian press. Boris Yeltsin once joked that every kid in Russia knows the names of Jackson and Vanik, and none of them particularly like either gentleman. This Jackson-Vanik modification is critical to Russia joining the World Trade Organization. Their efforts have been greatly complicated by the fact that we do not have permanent and unconditional normal trade relations or most favored nation status with them, and that is as a result of Jackson-Vanik. Both President Putin and President Medvedev have argued in favor of their country joining the World Trade Organization, acknowledging that their country's inability to join the WTO has stunted the Russian economy and made it less competitive. According to the Congressional Research Service, the change the United States would experience from Russia's graduation in terms of our trading relationship would be minimal. Russian imports have entered the United States on a constantly renewed normal trade relations basis since 1992. So this is not primarily a balance of payments issue or even a jobs issue. This is a foreign policy issue. Now, I've often said that I would like to see a grand bargain with Russia in which we would tender concessions not only on Jackson-Vanik but on other issues of importance to Russia, that we would listen carefully and perhaps modify our positions with regard to such issues as Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria, Moldova. But this major grand bargain would have to be in return for truly crippling, immediate, mandatory United Nations sanctions on Iran. The State Department isn't even talking about such sanctions, and so it seems unlikely that our State Department is going to negotiate a grand bargain worthy of the title. Preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons should be our #1 foreign policy objective. I do not expect Russia to massively change its policy toward Iran just on the Jackson-Vanik issue alone, and I don't think that it's credible for us to say that the only thing we're willing to change is Jackson-Vanik, and we're waiting for Russia to vote for massive and crippling sanctions on Iran. So our purpose here at these hearings is to focus on Jackson-Vanik as perhaps the sole immediate concession that we are willing to offer the Russian side. If we do so, we, as others have noted, it can be said that Moscow is in compliance with the purpose of Jackson-Vanik, which was to allow chiefly Soviet Jews to emigrate. But while the Jews of the Soviet Union are no longer being held hostage, their sacred papers are. And this is clearly something that needs to be dealt with before we change Jackson-Vanik. I refer to the Shearson collection of books and archives which are sacred chiefly to those Jews in the Chabad or Lubavitcher movement. I, without objection, will put into the record the many letters that I have sent to such Russian leaders as Vladimir Putin, which I have hand-delivered at the Russian embassy to the ambassador, which I have handed to virtually every Russian dignitary who has come to the United States and visited Capitol Hill since 2004. And when I didn't personally hand these letters to them, my good friend Dana Rohrabacher did. I want to note also for the record that I've never received a response. I did hear third-hand a rumor that the Russian response would, after 6 years, be that they seem to have some procedural defenses usable in both Russian and perhaps even American courts, but not a single word has been uttered as to why, as a matter of justice, the Russian state should retain these documents sacred to the Chabad movement. In particular, the Shearson collection of papers can be divided between the Shearson archives and the Shearson library. Let me focus chiefly for today on the archives. These were legally removed from the Soviet Union in the 1920s by Rabbi Shearson. They were seized by the Nazis and then fell into the hands of the Red Army. It is well established that assets seized by the Nazis should be returned to their rightful owners. And yet the Red Army and the Soviet state continues to hold these archives. Contrast that to the fact that certain Russian archives, chiefly the Smolensk archive, fell into American hands, I believe, after being captured by the Nazis. It took us a while, but in 2002, we returned these documents to the Russian state. It is disappointing that this unilateral concession, this return of important papers, was not matched by the return of the Shearson documents to the Chabad movement. Now, it is said that Jackson-Vanik has achieved its purpose. Jews are no longer being held hostage, but the sacred papers of the Chabad community are still held hostage. Tom Lantos, in April of 2007, declared that while he was chairman, Jackson-Vanik would not be lifted unless the Shearson collection was returned to the Chabad movement. I cannot make that pledge quite as strong because I'm not chairman of the full committee, but I will pledge to work hard to make sure that Tom Lantos's pledge remains viable, and that having returned the Smolensk archives, we should not be asked to sweep away Jackson-Vanik until not only the people but the sacred documents are also released. I yield back.
I thank my friend. I now go to the gentleman from California, the ranking member on the Committee on Oversight, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing and following up on discussions that we have had with people, with our counterparts in Russia, who were sincerely trying to develop a better relationship with us. And it was very difficult to explain to them why Jackson-Vanik is still on the books. I see one of our witnesses, my old friend, Steve, or I should say Ambassador, not Mr. or even Steve, Ambassador Sestanovich, who worked with me during the Reagan White House. And he worked there during the time when I remember Ronald Reagan went to Berlin. And there was considerable debate about what he should be saying, but when Ronald Reagan went to Berlin, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That was a long time ago. You look great for being all these years, Steve, but the fact is, Mr. Chairman, that was a long time ago, and so much has happened, and so I would ask my fellow colleagues to join me, and when it comes to Jackson-Vanik, let's tear down this wall. It is about time that the relic, that this ancient relic of the Cold War be discarded. That doesn't mean we don't have issues between us, but let's take this off the table because it is an impediment to negotiations and honest talks about setting up a better relationship between our countries. And this is especially true when one realizes that today, what you have in Russia is, yes, an imperfect democratic society, and we can talk about the imperfections all day long. We happen to have a lot of imperfections in our society as well. However, there are some demonstrable things that need to be better in Russia. But by and large, when you go to Russia, as compared to when I went to Russia in 1984, the churches are filled in Russia. And in fact, the Russian people are very religious people compared to many other people in the world. You go there, you hear criticism of the government in Russia. There are opposition parties. Now, yeah, they complain that they didn't get permits to do this or that, but there are opposition parties and their voice is heard, and they get to have demonstrations. there are actually opposition newspapers. You hear people on radio complaining about the administration. Now, there are some problems that we would like to point out, things that were done that we wouldn't have liked to have seen done in terms of some of the communications industry. But by and large, there's been an overwhelming reform that's gone on in Russia in these last 30 years since Jackson-Vanik was put into place. An overwhelming reform that's so visible and so apparent. People are free to travel now where they weren't permitted to travel. Not only were they not permitted to travel, they could be shot trying to get over the fence back in the 1980s. And we still have Jackson-Vanik, and we have not opened up the economic and political cooperation that we need to develop the kind of close relationship that would be beneficial to our people. And let's just note this. At the same time, while we're keeping these relics from the Cold War on the table, we have provided China with most favored nation status, permanent most favored nation status. We've permitted China continued access to our markets. There's been transfers of technology. There's been major investments. We have built the Chinese economy, and there hasn't been one iota of political reform in China. For us to complain about the shortcomings of Russia while permitting this massive buildup of the Chinese economy and that is now ruled by a government that has had none of this reform is so contradictory that we can see why perhaps the Russians are confused whether or not we want them to be our friends or not. Well, if we are to have peace in this world, if we are to have prosperity in this world, if Americans are going to be secure, we've got to have a good relationship with Russia. Whether it's combating radical Islam or whether it's confronting the Frankenstein monster of a totalitarian China emerging on the world scene, in either one of these things, which are great threats to us, we need Russia on our side. So we need to start treating them fairly and being rational and quit leaving things like Jackson-Vanik relics of the Cold War around to be impediments to developing a better relationship. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And I think the final member on the Democratic side that wants to make a comment is also from California, Congresswoman Diane Watson. But Diane, before I recognize you, I just want to note for the record, and I'm going to, and I know that Brad Sherman possibly had a private conversation, and I'll let him identify the conversation with Mr. Lantos. But I'd be remiss not to note that on February 21st, 2007, over Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, it was reported that U.S. Congressman Tom Lantos has called for an end to a decades-old U.S. restriction on trade with Russia. Speaking in Moscow, Lantos called the 1974 Jackson-Vanik Amendment a relic of the Cold War and vowed to spare no effort in seeking its removal. So we have somewhat of a disagreement, but I wanted to read that into the record. And I now call on Congresswoman Watson for sure.
Yeah.
Request.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Diane, if I could just speak for 1 minute before
We won't.
recognize.
You'll still have all the time you need.
Is 60
Brad.
seconds in that 1 minute?
Yes. I have no doubt that in February of 2007, Tom Lantos wanted to see us repeal Jackson-Vanik. He then met with people concerned about the Shearson collection in April 2007, and that's when he took the position that, of course, he'd like to see Jackson-Vanik abolished, but only when these papers are turned over. I think he and I would have thought then that this would be a relatively simple matter. These papers are providing no particular benefit to Russia. It is like the dog on top of the pile of hay, chasing every other animal away. The dog is not going to eat the hay. He's just there because the cow wants it. I also would point out that if, and I know the title of this hearing says that maybe Jackson-Vanik is a relic of history. Not all relics of history should be swept into the dustbin of history. The U.S. ownership of Alaska is a relic of the Lincoln administration. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and will agree if he so chooses, since the Subcommittee on Europe would have jurisdiction, we'd be happy to call for a separate hearing on the Schneerson papers and accommodate your concerns. And having said that, let me now recognize the gentle lady from California, Ms. Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was there with Congressman Lantos when he made that statement, and I got the feeling that we should support it. And I think Arbacher was maybe traveling with us at the time. Past U.S. presidents have continued to determine that Russia has been in full compliance with Title IV of the Trade Act of 1974 since September of 1994. The Congress has not given any president the authority to repeal Jackson-Vanik. However, it's important to recognize the responsibility that we as policymakers have to consider any consequences of possible trade injury repealing Jackson-Vanik would cause the U.S. commerce. And I'm so pleased to hear you say, Mr. Chairman, that we'll have a subsequent hearing on this issue. I think it's very important to look at it from both sides, but I was very pleased with the atmosphere that we got from the members of their parliament and the openness that was not there when I first went to Russia in the 60s. So we do need to really look deeply at this question and weigh it. So I look forward to listening to the panel, and I thank them for appearing before the committee. Yield back.
I thank the gentle lady. Now we come to the important part of the afternoon, which is to listen to our distinguished witnesses. Let me begin by introducing Ed Verona. By the way, you all have extensive resumes, and I will shorten them and just pick out the highlights. Ed Verona was appointed President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Business Council on June 1st, 2008. Prior to that, he was the Vice President of ExxonMobil Russia, and obviously was based in Moscow. He has a BA in Political Science from the University of Arizona and a Master's of International Management from the American Graduate School of Global Management. Next, we have Mark Levin. Mark Levin has been the Executive Director of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry since 1992. In November of 2008, Mr. Levin was the Soviet Jewry Freedom Award recipient at the Boston-based Russian Jewish Community Foundation's annual gala. In September of 2008, Ukrainian President Yushchenko awarded him the Order of Merit Medal in New York. And in June 2006, he was honored for 25 years of distinguished service with NCSJ here in Washington. He has an extensive background. Prior to coming to NCJS, he worked for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and he's a graduate of the University of Maryland. Ambassador Sestanovich is the George Kennan Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Catherine and Shelby Davis Professor of International Diplomacy at Columbia University. His particular areas of expertise are Russia and the former Soviet Union, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and U.S. foreign policy. He served as ambassador at large and special advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states from 1997 to 2001. In this capacity, he was the State Department's principal officer responsible for policy towards the states of the former Soviet Union. He has his Ph.D. from Harvard and his B.A. from Cornell. He has written numerous books. Next, we have Dr. Edward Lozansky, who is the president of the American University in Moscow, the first private university in Russia, which he founded in 1990 with Dr. Yuri Osipian, at that time Gorbachev's science advisor, and Gavril Popov, former mayor of Moscow. He's also founder and president of the World Russian Forum, an annual convention here in the U.S. Congress since 1981 to discuss the most important issues in U.S.-Russia relations and to promote the idea of U.S.-Russian strategic alliance. He graduated from the Moscow Institute of Physics and Engineering and received his Ph.D. in theoretical and mathematical physics from the Moscow Institute of Atomic Energy. He's the author of 14 books and over 400 articles in the areas of science and humanities. He is a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Social Services. Mark Talisman, born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He graduated from Harvard with honors. For 14 years, he was the chief of staff to the co-author of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, Congressman Charles Yannick. He is the founding director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Council of Jewish Federations. He is married with 2 children and 2 grandchildren. And next we have David Satter. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a fellow in the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He was the Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times of London from 1976 to 1982. He has written on Russia and the former Soviet Union for more than 3 decades. He contributes frequently on Russian affairs to the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and National Review online. He is presently completing a new book about the Russian attitude towards the communist past. Welcome all. And we'll begin with Mr. Verona.
Thank you very much, Chairman Delahunt. Thank you for the honor of allowing me to testify here on today on a subject which is of vital importance to the organization which I have the privilege to lead. The USRBC represents approximately 250 companies, 80% of which are American, with the remainder being Russian and from third countries. Our membership encompasses a broad swath of industries, with companies ranging in size from those in the Fortune 100 to small consultancies and nonprofit organizations. They are leaders in the aerospace, automotive, consumer goods, high-tech, and financial services sectors, among others. Our members employ a substantial number of U.S. citizens who produce manufactured goods, develop and market advanced technologies, create entertainment products, and provide financial and other services to one of the fastest growing emerging market economies. During most of the past decade, our U.S. member companies found Russia to be one of their most lucrative global markets, with many seeing annual growth rates in sales and revenues of over 20%. Indeed, the growth in U.S.-Russia trade has been nothing short of remarkable over most of the past decade, from $9 billion in 2001 to $36 billion in 2008. Before the global recession hit in the latter half of 2008, our bilateral trade was on track to exceed $40 billion that year. While still modest in terms of overall U.S. trade, this volume represents a 4-fold increase over the 2001-2008 period. U.S. exports to Russia, which comprise about 1/3 of the total, are for the most part high value-added goods that have provided skilled jobs for American workers and have earned American brands a solid reputation in Russia for quality. We believe that the potential for increasing U.S. exports to Russia is much greater than the levels already achieved. With the global economic and trade recovery now underway, and with the return of economic growth in Russia, we anticipate a gradual resumption of growth in bilateral trade. Unlike their counterparts in most developed markets, Russian consumers are coming out of this recession relatively debt-free and therefore more likely to resume purchasing patterns of the past, including many iconic American brand products, which they equate with a better quality of life. And our member companies are ready to take advantage of that opportunity. I mention the foregoing since I believe that it is useful to establish why U.S. business has a stake in the question that has been posed by this panel. Is it time to repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment for Russia? On the basis of the Trade Act of 1974, with regard to restrictions on immigration from the Soviet Union, it would appear that the main reason for that legislation was a situation that no longer pertains in the case of Russia. In fact, every U.S. president, as previously mentioned here, since 1994 has found Russia to be in compliance with the immigration provisions of the amendment and has waived its application to Russia. The late Congressman Tom Lantos, now cited several times, who for years was one of the leading proponents of the amendment, said, as Chairman Delahunt has mentioned shortly before he died, that it was time to put behind us this relic of the Cold War and would spare no effort to bring that about. With respect to the other condition of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, namely the absence of a market economy, I would only note that the United States has officially recognized the Russian Federation as a market economy since 2002. It is hard to argue today in favor of maintaining Jackson-Vanik on the grounds of either condition, immigration restrictions, or the lack of a market economy. On the other hand, it is becoming increasingly obvious that the continued application of this amendment is undermining American efforts to encourage Russia to move toward a society and an economic system based on the rule of law. 3 consecutive United States administrations have urged Russia to adopt and uphold internationally accepted standards of jurisprudence and advocated Russia's membership in rules-based international financial and trade organizations. Yet in the case of Jackson-Vanik, we appear to twist the interpretation and implementation of our own law. The State Department has attested in numerous annual human rights reports that Russia does not restrict immigration on the basis of religious or ethnic identity. The United States also supports Russia's accession to the WTO. Failure on our part to reflect in our trade legislation the fundamental changes that have occurred since the enactment of Jackson-Vanik would appear to contradict the findings and policy positions of our own government. There are some who argue that we should not give something to Russia in return for nothing. Seen from Russia's perspective, this amounts to shifting the goalposts. It raises doubts about U.S. adherence to the letter and intent of the law and sets a precedent of spurious reciprocity that Russia could exploit to its advantage in other circumstances. Keeping Jackson-Vanik on the books as bargaining leverage, which demonstratively it no longer affords, engenders cynicism and resentment and complicates efforts to establish a normal relationship with Russia. The USRBC acts as the Secretariat for the Coalition for U.S.-Russia Trade, an organization representing more than 60 companies and trade associations who stand ready to advocate congressional graduation of Russia from the provisions of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and adoption of permanent normal trade relations with Russia once that country enters the WTO. Within the coalition are companies that have concerns about a number of trade issues with respect to Russia. Specifically, there are questions about Russia's implementation and enforcement of intellectual property rights, about lapses in following science-based regulatory standards for imported poultry and pork products, and about the selective imposition of import tariffs against U.S. manufacturers. These and other critically important issues for business are being addressed in Geneva through negotiations on Russia's WTO accession. That is the appropriate venue, and the WTO is the appropriate instrument for ensuring Russian conformity with international trade rules. When Russia eventually enters the WTO on the basis of a commercially meaningful agreement, The United States will be prevented from enjoying the benefits of greater market access to Russia if we have not, in the interim, lifted Jackson-Vanik. This is a prerequisite to granting PNTR, without which we will be in violation of WT rules and therefore at a disadvantage to other nations who will compete against us to sell goods and services to the vibrant Russian market which I described before. The result would be fewer American jobs as export opportunities are lost. In our recommendations to the Obama administration in January 2009, the USRBC urged the administration to rescind Jackson-Vanik without prior condition as a gesture of goodwill to Russia and as a way to create momentum for the reset of the relationship. My experience convinces me that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment has had no dissuasive or positive effect on Russia's trade or domestic economic policies. Rather, it has served as a convenient pretext for Russia failing to take the steps necessary to bring itself into compliance with the rules-based trading community. I believe, therefore, that it is a relic of a bygone era and that it is time for the United States to remove its applicability to Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Verona. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask that my full statement be admitted into the record, and I'll summarize.
Without objection.
Since 1971, NCSJ has represented nearly 50 national Jewish organizations. They include the Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith International, Hadassah, and AIPAC, as well as hundreds of local Jewish community councils, committees, and federations across the country. 2010 marks the 30th anniversary of my professional involvement with NCSJ. I made my first trip to Russia in 1982 when I led a congressional delegation that met with Soviet officials and Jewish activists. I have worked on Jackson-Vanik issues since the start of my tenure with NCSJ. The cause of free emigration is personally and professionally very important to me. It heartens me to see former Soviet bloc countries rejoin the community of free nations. Several of these countries have already graduated from Jackson-Vanik requirements in recent years, most recently Ukraine in 2006.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to take this opportunity to summarize our basic points. First, NCSJ supports the graduation of the Russian Federation from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Graduation, not repeal of the amendment. The Russian Federation has fulfilled the requirements of the Jackson-Vanik legislation, and we believe the administration and Congress should move forward on graduation for Russia. This development would be a key step forward for Russia and for the Russian-American relationship. Second, we base our position on the undeniable fact that Russia today allows free immigration for all its citizens, something that was denied to them during the 74 years of Soviet rule. Also, I wish to note, as you did, Mr. Chairman, that there are no longer any visa tourist requirements between Russia and Israel. Russia's Jewish community has undergone nothing short of a renaissance over the last 20 years. Synagogues, day schools, community centers, and kosher restaurants are now open in many large Russian cities. Over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews have emigrated to Israel, the United States, and elsewhere since 1991. All these facts are true indicators of Russia's satisfaction of Jackson-Vanik requirements and a testament to the amendment's extraordinary success in helping to secure freedom of emigration for Russian Jews and others wishing to emigrate from Russia. NCSJ has supported a presidential Jackson-Vanik waiver for Russia since 1991. We worked closely with President George W. Bush to promote Russia's graduation starting in 2001. In 2009, President Barack Obama said that graduating Russia from Jackson-Vanik would be a foreign policy priority for his administration, something that we recommended during the transition period. Given the progress made by Russia in observing freedom of movement since the fall of communism, we continue to press for Russia's graduation. The United States government has granted Russia an exemption from Jackson-Vanik requirements by a presidential compliance determination every year since 1994. This was something that was done with our strong endorsement. After 16 years of proven compliance, the time has come to graduate Russia from the amendment. Mr. Chairman, almost all major Russian Jewish organizations strongly support graduating Russia from Jackson-Vanik. This is one of the best arguments I can make in favor of graduation. The U.S. Congress created the Jackson-Vanik Amendment with the plight of the Soviet Jewish community in mind. This community, now Russian, no longer Soviet, says today these requirements are no longer needed. This does not excuse the Russian government from addressing the very real problems in the Russian Federation that still confront its Jewish communities and others. First, I'd like to note, anti-Semitic incidents continue across the country. Secondly, the rise of ultra-violent, nationalistic, skinhead, and neo-Nazi youth groups is a very troubling phenomenon, as is the Russian government's inconsistent prosecution of hate crimes. And lastly, certain aspects of the 1997 law on religion, which requires registration of religious organizations and communities with the authorities, continue to be a problem. NCSJ will keep engaging the Russian government strongly and persistently on these and other problematic areas in the human rights field. We meet regularly with Russian officials in the United States, in Russia, and at international fora to make our position known. We have raised our general concern over human rights in Russia at every level of Russia's government. We laud the praiseworthy intent of Senator Jackson and Congressman Vanik and their congressional colleagues who crafted this groundbreaking legislation nearly 40 years ago as a sign of America's commitment to freedom of immigration and religion worldwide. And now we think it is time to move forward and recognize the profound changes for the better that have taken place in Russia and in Russia's Jewish community. Jackson-Vanik was instrumental in creating the opportunity for Jews and others throughout the former Soviet Union to move freely and to find new ways to express their identity. The United States' reset in relations with Russia offers similar potential for progress in ways we did not imagine just 20 years ago. NCSJ and our member organizations are working to keep Russia's Jewish revival going. We want to ensure that the freedom to leave remains in place in Russia and elsewhere, and that those who decide to stay can continue to build their communities. NCSJ looks forward to continuing to work with Congress on these vital issues. And Mr. Chairman, again, our position is to support graduation, not repeal of the legislation. We believe that Jackson-Vanik is not a relic. We believe that Jackson-Vanik is a testament to America's commitment to freedom, and that Jackson-Vanik is one of the great success stories of post-World War II in relationship to American foreign policy. Mr. Chairman, lastly, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity and look forward to working with you and others on the subcommittees.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ambassador Sestanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hit that button,
I
Steve.
appreciate the opportunity to join in today's discussion. I have a fuller statement that I hope can be included in the record.
Without objection.
The Jackson-Vanik Amendment has a proud and honorable past, but it has sunk into a state of purposelessness and confusion. It once symbolized American human rights concerns and facilitated the free emigration of hundreds of thousands of people. Today, it remains on the books for reasons that have nothing to do with free immigration, which Russia has allowed for years. Instead, many members of Congress seem to believe that keeping the amendment in force can assure better treatment of American products in the Russian market. This transformation of landmark human rights legislation into a trade weapon is dispiriting to many people, but there's no avoiding it. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment is inextricably intertwined today with disputes about meat and poultry and other American exports. No proposal for how to deal with it is likely to succeed unless it also takes commercial interests into account. That's why the default policy of many on Jackson-Vanik of both Republican and Democratic administrations has been to do nothing until accession to the WTO, Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, is concluded. Congress would then be expected to pass a resolution that graduates Russia, that is, that declares the amendment has nothing to do, no longer applies to it. Russia's actions over the past year, including new restrictions on American exports and Prime Minister Putin's mishandling of negotiations with the WTO, have reinforced this default strategy. Nevertheless, waiting for WTO accession before graduation has several drawbacks. It means that Congress will not act until it has no choice but to approve the final result. It means that if accession talks drag on, American exporters will remain vulnerable to arbitrary restrictions imposed on them by the Russian bureaucracy. And, most importantly, it dodges the key task that the U.S. government will face after graduation: how to advance the original goals of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which applied not only to free immigration, but to human rights. Today, there are some signs that Russian policymakers understand how unsustainable and counterproductive their handling of trade policy has been. If the next few months bring signs of a new Russian approach, Congress should be prepared to devise a new approach as well, one that advances both American commercial interests as well as Jackson-Vanik's original concern. Here's how it might work. The core element of a new approach would, of course, involve a willingness to graduate Russia from the coverage of the law, but it would include other elements as well. Congress might require side letters fully explaining the administration's view of remaining accession problems. Congress will want firm and specific commitments about how the administration intends to address these problems. Congress should also require, before voting on graduation, that the administration set out its future strategy for addressing issues of human rights, democracy promotion, and engagement with Russian civil society. The resolution that graduates Russia from Jackson-Vanik might also provide for a delay in taking effect until Russia's full accession to the WTO. But graduation would happen automatically unless both houses of Congress voted for a resolution of disapproval. If such a resolution passed, the status quo would be restored. That is, normal trading relations, but not permanent normal trading relations. Compared to the current strategy of waiting for the WTO to complete the process of accession, this approach would serve American interests in three important respects. First, economic. By confirming that PNTR would take effect automatically with WTO accession, it would add to Russian incentives to drop its neo-protectionist measures. Second, political. It would reinforce the so-called reset of Russian-American relations and highlight the economic benefits that President Medvedev has said he is looking for from it. It would also highlight how little Russia has otherwise done to put aside the preoccupations of the Cold War. Finally, this approach would focus the attention of both Congress and the administration on the key issue that led to the adoption of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in the first place: the evolution of Russia's own political and legal system. The United States cannot expect to advance its interest in Russia's democratic evolution in the same way that we did in the 1970s and 1980s, when Congressman Rohrabacher and I worked together. We need a modernized strategy, one that reflects both the dramatic changes that have taken place inside Russia and those that have not. The administration has some interesting ideas in this regard, and some of them have begun to be put into practice. Congress can help to consolidate and institutionalize these innovations by making them part of the process of graduation. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment no longer offers us an effective policy. The task of Congress is to use graduation to refocus our strategy on the importance of Russia's continuing democratic evolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Lozansky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have a full statement which I would like to add to the record. My short answer to the subject of this panel is very clear and unequivocal. This graduation is absolutely necessary and is long overdue. I think it had to be done almost 20 years ago when communism collapsed and the new country, which has emerged from the ruins of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, has lifted all restrictions, not only on citizen rights to immigration and travel, but even such a term as exit visa has been eliminated from the judicial vocabulary. On this distinguished panel, I probably was the only one who benefited personally from Jackson-Vanik Amendment, since I was separated from my family for about 6 years, more than 6 years, And I believe that due to Jackson-Vanik amendment, eventually my wife and child were able to come to the United States and join me here. And by the way, my wife is here with me, and we have now 3 grandchildren. So I can, from the personal experience, can tell you that when she came, we personally thanked Senator Jackson. We came to Congress, we met Senator Jackson, Senator Kennedy, and over 100 members of Congress who signed petition to Mr. Brezhnev to release my wife and child and come here. So it was a great thing, but it's, every political initiative, every political move has to have some time limits. And time is now to graduate Russia from this amendment because it serves no purpose. All the requirements which were demanded are fulfilled. Russian, not only Jews, but every Russian citizen can now travel back and forth. And it's interesting that even Jews who emigrated to Israel, into the United States or Canada or other countries, go back and forth. And some of them returned, some of them still live in Israel and the United States, but do business and actually benefit from their contacts in both countries. And Jackson-Vanik amendment actually makes a problem for them, because every time Russians ask them what's going on, why we still have this Jackson-Vanik in the book if you go back and forth. And maybe I have to say that maybe even there is no state anti-Semitism in Russia anymore. But this Jackson-Vanik amendment maybe is a reason for some people expressing some anti-Semitic views, because they see it as a Jewish problem which creates problem for US-Russia relations. Although freedom of the press was not really part of the Jackson-Vanik amendment, still it's very important to think about democracy. And we keep hearing that there's no freedom of the press in Russia. This is not so. I go back and forth all the time. As a matter of fact, I'm now teaching even a course at Moscow State University. Yes, 3 major TV channels are under government control, but there are hundreds or maybe even thousands of TV channels which are free and operate as private channels. Moreover, interesting, I don't think that too many people in this audience know that, except Russian experts, that there are sites, internet sites, which is freely accessible to Russians, no restrictions, no censorship, has government-funded sites which translate articles, even most critical articles about Putin, about Medvedev, and they translate them in Russia, so every Russian citizen has access not only to information of the Russian newspapers, but also to American media, and including, of course, critical articles of my colleague David Setter. Russians can read them openly on internet. And now we know that close to 40 or even 50% of Russians have access. So there's freedom of the press to this extent. It's not perfect, but it exists. I already mentioned that I'm teaching a course now at Moscow State University on US-Russian relations. I can say anything I want, no restrictions. Moreover, I am inviting on Skype American experts who can also address Russian students and tell them their position. And both, some of them are pretty critical, and there's lively discussion. But after each lecture, students keep asking, why are you keeping this Jackson-Vanik amendment in the books? Because we don't know why you're doing this. Because if on one hand you're saying that we want better relations, but then this amendment actually ruins chances for better US-Russian cooperation. Another example, for example, there are many American think tanks now who have offices in Moscow. I happen to share my office of American University in Moscow on the same floor Heritage Foundation. Everyone knows that Heritage Foundation is very critical of Russian policy and of Vladimir Putin and President Medvedev and everyone else. Still, they can say anything they want. They have access to the media, access to public opinion, and including, by the way, Steve Sestanovich Carnegie Foundation. They also have office in one of the most prestigious places in Moscow, Pushkin Square, Carnegie. They have regular seminars, discussions. They have visitors from the United States. So Russia is a free country. Yes, it's not perfect democracy in the American sense of the word, but it's a free country. We are now talking about, of course, Jackson-Vanik amendment. It's a very narrow issue. But if the United States lifts and graduates Russia from this amendment, I believe it will be a tremendous boost to US-Russian cooperation in many issues, including Iran, including nuclear nonproliferation, terrorism, and many other issues which we are facing. That's why I really urge all members of Congress vote to graduate Russia from this amendment as soon as possible, and it had to be done 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, Mr. Talisman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciated Mr. Scott's lyrical and cultural references to start a hearing. We should have done that years ago at the Ways and Means Committee. It would have lightened things a little. And also a number of other things which I want to touch on, which you have brought up, which enhance the record statement that I made, which I hope will be inserted appropriately.
Without objection.
Jackson-Vanik was an idea that I didn't even think was going to work when Charlie Vanik and I were talking about it. You should know, just for this is the place I can say it now in the record officially, where he lived for so long, that he went on his own personal Codell in December of 1971. He wouldn't even allow me to accompany him on the back of a Harley in black leather to tour Mother Russia. And it was during that time the effects of the travel ban and education ban were put in force. This was a Catholic kid raised in Cleveland. I knew his parents, his mother, very well, and ingrained in him, as with your constituents up in Massachusetts, was what I call Bible talk as street language, not for special favors from the church. And he saw the antithetical activities going on the ground, and he came back absolutely outraged. And I spent my moment in hell on bread and water at the Congressional Reading Room finding a precedent. Until I found it, I was not released. And I found it in a little book from Mr. Orbach, a nice green little volume of precedents of some sort with two czars, with Abraham Lincoln and our other professor, Professor Wilson, in 1912, with suspension of American trade with both because of pogroms, not only against the Jewish population, but within the embassies where there were Jews serving their country and got beat up when they left the embassy grounds. So it was not new in our body politic. The Vanik Amendment died with the session. And then came 1972, which was a huge tidal wave of all sorts of mixed emotions, needless to say, because while Mr. Nixon was among the brightest presidents we had among our folk on the other side of the aisle, he was not a guy you wanted to travel to Russia with. So as a consequence, when that bond took place and the opening came there and in China, and Scoop Jackson did his thing, and we did for 18 months before the Senate could act, and that's very important because that was an 18 months hanging in space as to whether this concept could work. The kind of activities that are represented here at the table at much later years that engendered a huge swell of activity for something brand new in terms of citizen action at a precinct level all over this country makes me have to say, Mr. Rohrabaugh, that we are offended personally at the notion, and I mean this not personally, of talking about the antique nature of this relic, because that makes me much older than I feel. And I can name you in private things that I know in the law that I was involved in, including one that was applied yesterday to save a human life that came from a law that was established by executive order in 1979. If it weren't on the books gathering dust, we couldn't have revived it. And I got to say, my advice to you all is do not repeal it. Keep it in the tool bag and let Russia properly be liberated.
Graduated?
No, I'm saying liberated first as a state of psychiatric state of mind, and secondly, by term of the art, to be graduated and replace graduation for repeal. I had this talk before the late, great chairman, Congressman Lantos, for whom I had the highest regard and have knew for 40 years. And it was after he made the statement you referred to. And he said to me personally, I understand now, I'll temper my language, is what he said to me. Because, you know, part of the cultural effects of the Cold War were use of language. And the kind of language we use, you know, sometimes, I don't know about you, but I know when I was writing speeches for Mr. Vanik, both of us wanted to try to find a technique to put things that are coming out of our mouth back in before they were recognized. We all have that.
No one on this panel has
I
ever
know.
had that problem.
I should have premised that. The fact is that I've also learned a personal lesson because I felt I had a price on my head among those with whom I had contact in the Soviet Union. It was a death-dealing kind of thing for me because my family came from there. And my great-grandfather was the Grand Rabbi of Russia. And we sort of knew when he left in 1903, he told me personally, he lived a long life. He said to me, don't follow me in my profession, go out and work in the precincts to help the democracy work, because when he came here, he kissed the ground because he voted within a month after arriving. We had good precinct captains apparently during.
I don't want to ask if he was legal or illegal.
Did it matter? Where do you come from?
I'm an Irish American, Mr. Talisman. I know the drill.
Anyway, I had a most amazing thing happen to me personally. I did an exhibition called Scrolls from the Dead Sea, the real ones that had been hidden for years. And it opened at the Madison Building of the Library of Congress. And I always had a habit of all the 25 major exhibits I've done here to invite the embassies, because they never get invited to things like that, the whole embassy. Even the people who are driving car, everybody, their families. I would have a dedicated evening, and I asked the Russian ambassador, who had been trying to see me lots. And I reversed the tables, and they came. And within a month, I had a telephone call. Now, instinctively, I did not accept the invitation he gave to go within the compound on Wisconsin Avenue. I couldn't do that yet. But we did have lunch, and he asked me the most astonishing thing. And this was when things were pretty tough after freedom came in Russia. He said, you know, we have a problem with America. And I said, here we go again. The problem was different, and some of you know this from your talks and your visits. They have always felt like the stepchildren of World War II, even though their losses were enormous. And Stalin essentially suspended communism to get everybody in the war after all the screw-ups. He said, we want you to go to Russia. We will give you the keys to every case you want to, and every storage place you want to open. We need the story told of the 1,184 days of the Russian involvement in World War II. Because as Eisenhower himself says on film, and this is the ambassador, we did not win the war at D-Day with 5 million Russians on the Eastern Front and our blood all over the place. They were there. And I did it. I was there for 18 months in every nook and cranny of their storage with the most amazing artifacts that were real, including the hand notations of Hitler and of Stalin on all those treaties that we talk about, with the treaties, their own copies, everything. And every morning at 10 o'clock in the morning for 10 days at the Reagan Building, this was the first exhibit there, I was on national television, Channel 1 across Russia, taking a 1-hour tour for the Russian nation for all 11 time zones. What it meant to the Russian people was absolutely remarkable, and it shows what cultural cooperation, and it meant that to the successive cultural ministers. The one suggestion that comes out, that comes from the little repartee you just had, is that while the Chabad treasures of documents, which are so vital to that community, are really important, they're only important within the context of the fact that Russia took everything it wanted from as booty of war, from the entry into Germany. That meant it took a lot of Nazi-stolen art belonging to the Jewish community leadership. It is enormous, and they all know it. And we had a State Department conference, which I co-chaired, a huge conference, and subsequent conferences where Russia has actually codified all that was taken, and they say it is fine, but it is ours. Well, this is a giant example of what needs to be worked on in a normal and regular order, as is said in this House.
Thank you, Mr. Talisman.
And that's it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Satter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Could you hit the button, please? Thank you.
Is this better? Yes, it
Hit
is.
that reset button, Mr.
Yeah,
Sestanovich.
okay.
Make that effort.
All right, I did. The future of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment has now become an important issue in U.S.-Russian relations. The reason is that the U.S., having announced a reset in U.S.-Russian relations, canceled an anti-missile system in Eastern Europe, and ignored Russian human rights abuses, all with little positive result, is running out of ways to show its goodwill. Those who support rescinding the amendment point out that Russia has been in compliance for the last 16 years. They argue it makes no sense to retain a measure that has achieved its purpose and only serves to embitter bilateral relations. Unfortunately, however, we are in danger of being too literal. It's true that Russia now allows free immigration, but the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was never based on an unbreakable link between trade and immigration. Opponents of the amendment correctly argued at the time that trade has nothing to do with immigration. The purpose of the amendment was to use the economic power of the United States to compel the Soviet Union to respect human rights. In this respect, it's far from obsolete when applied to Russia today. By any measure, Russia is more liberal than the Soviet Union, but it is also totally lawless, and the absence of secure rights is not an accident. It exists because it's necessary to assure the power of a kleptocratic elite which puts its interests ahead of those of the nation. This creates a parallel with what existed under the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet authorities, the present Russian leaders use a supposed foreign menace to divert the attention of the population from their rightless situation. The target of choice is not Iran or North Korea, countries which could pose a real threat to Russia, but rather the United States. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment in and of itself cannot have a decisive impact on U.S.-Russian relations. But in deciding whether to rescind it, it's important to remember that good relations with Russia are not an end in themselves. The late Andrei Sakharov pointed out that there's a direct connection between the Soviet Union's internal repression and its external expansionism. In Russia today, massive corruption and lawlessness give rise to policies that frustrate U.S. objectives as a matter of proactive self-defense. The object of American policy should be to seek to change this fundamental relationship. Jackson-Vanik Amendment should not be eliminated to bury the Cold War or reinvigorate the dubious reset. It can be rescinded, but this should be done only in response to examples of clear progress in democratic governance, capable of limiting the scope of arbitrary power in Russia, improving the lot of the population. The following are examples of areas in which improvements could legitimately be tied to the elimination of Jackson-Vanik. First of all, the legal system. In the opinion of Russians, the legal system is prejudiced, inefficient, corrupt, and ready to defend whoever can pay for it. A Supreme Court judge, Tamara Marshakova, argued that judicial independence in Russia is non-existent, stating that any official can dictate any decision in any case. A good example is the situation of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a Putin opponent who now faces his second trial, this time accused of stealing virtually the entire production of the Yukos Oil Company. If convicted, and it's virtually a foregone conclusion that he will be, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. He was convicted in 2005 of failing to pay taxes on Yukos profits. At that time, no one suggested that the oil on which those taxes were levied had been embezzled. Another sign of the state of the rule of law in Russia is that Russians file more complaints with the European Court than people from any of the 46 countries that make up the Council of Europe. Most of the thousands of complaints are never heard, but of the small number that have been, almost all have gone against Russia. Perhaps more important is the question of selective terror. There's no mass repression in Russia, but journalists and human rights activists risk their lives if their reporting threatens powerful interests. At least 17 journalists have been murdered in Russia since 2000. In not a single case has the person who ordered the killing been found. In cases such as those of Anna Politkovskaya and the American Paul Klebnikov, where underlings have been charged, only to be acquitted under puzzling circumstances, The alleged participants appear to have a maze of links to the security services themselves. Natalia Estimirova, a single mother who was virtually the only source of information on torture, abduction, and murders carried out by the security services in Chechnya, was herself abducted in Grozny and murdered last year. Sergei Magnitsky, a lawyer for Hermitage Capital Management, who exposed a $230 million tax fraud carried out by Russian officials, was accused of corruption himself and jailed. He then died in a prison medical isolation unit after warning the prison staff that someone was trying to murder him. Subsequent events indicate that he accurately foretold his fate. And finally, anti-American propaganda in the Russian media. The reset in U.S.-Russian relations is largely a figment of our imagination and is something which is, operates in only one direction, with us acknowledging that we've done something wrong, which of course we haven't. Anti-Western propaganda in the Russian media continues, and it's pervasive, and it affects the way in which the Russian population views the U.S. The Russian regime reacts badly to U.S. efforts to support Russian democracy, but we have an interest in the success of democratic processes in Russia. Democracy in Russia, the world's second nuclear power, means stability. At the same time, undemocratic Russia is unpredictable. In a crisis, it's too easy to mobilize a rightless population against the U.S. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment surely will eventually be rescinded, but with regard to Russia. But this should be done in response to improvements in Russia's internal situation. In the absence of such improvements, haste in scrapping Jackson-Vanik is simply not necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Satter. Let me direct a question to you, Ambassador Sestanovich. You just heard the testimony by Mr. Satter. I'll tell you what my problem is. We speak to the rule of law, and we maintain that this is an abiding principle in our democracy. And yet we've heard arguments and valid observations about Russian behavior. But the law, as I understand it, is clear. And it's clear in the sense that its rationale is predicated on what I consider to be a human right, the right to travel, the right to emigrate. I have been advocating, by the way, for Americans' right to travel to Cuba. I don't like the fact that we have a travel police here in the United States called OFAC, where grandmothers are fined because they took a bicycle tour around Cuba. So I'm there on this particular fundamental right, this value. But what I'm hearing is we need to get something. You know, we can give it when we see improvements in democratic governance in Russia. What I would submit, and I would ask you, Ambassador, and everyone else can comment on it, in the eyes of Americans, aren't we eroding the principle of rule of law, respect for the law, when we say this was about the right to travel and immigration, but now, oh, it's about a lot of other things too. When the overwhelming consensus of scholarly analysis of Jackson-Vanik, as drafted by Mr. Talisman and Representative Vanik, was to ensure that it would end restrictions on immigration. Now we're taking that and we're using it not as a scalpel, but boy, we've got it and we're going to use it and we don't give a damn about the rule of law. Is that the message that we're sending?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look at the language of Jackson-Vanik, it actually says in the very first sentence that its purpose is to assure the continued dedication of the United States to fundamental human rights. It focused on immigration, and there were many historical reasons for that. Over time, the law became a symbol of what it announced in its very first sentence, which is a commitment to fundamental human rights. But I agree with you, the connection that it established and the condition that it established was
If I can interrupt,
Yeah.
if one read the legislative history and reviewed the congressional record in terms of the debate in committee, on the floor, both on the House and the Senate, I dare say it was exclusively limited to the plight of Soviet Jewry.
Right. That is a correct, I think, description of the legislative history, although I'll be honest with you, I haven't read it. I would answer you slightly differently. If I thought, and if any member of the panel here thought that you could solve the problem of the lawlessness of the Russian system by keeping Jackson-Vanik on the books, or by trying to pursue some kind of deal, I think we'd all be in favor of it. My problem with trying to solve all of these problems of Russia's internal evolution is not that Jackson and Vanik didn't want to solve them. It's that you can't do it. We need to retain a policy that focuses on the importance of Russia's internal evolution for reasons that I think most people here would probably agree with. That kind of evolution is important to the United States, but you can't do it through Jackson-Vanik. That leverage just isn't there. Whether it stays on the books or not, we are not going to be able to bring about the kind of change that we would like. That's why in my remarks, Mr. Chairman, I emphasize the importance of coming up with a new policy, a modernized policy that addresses some of those concerns.
Before I go to Mr. Talisman, I noted in your prepared statement that you quoted Nathan Sharansky saying that this great tool, which is Jackson-Vanik, for the advancement of human rights has become a weapon of the U.S. agricultural lobby. You know, I think that's a very insightful remark. And I think to introduce the commercial interests, and I'm not naive, into this issue, in some ways does a disservice to the legacy of Jackson-Vanik, because it was about human rights. It was about human rights. Mr. Talisman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The legislative history, as we sort of lived it day by day, was emigration. It was not only Soviet Jewry.
Right.
We met with all faiths in basements in the middle of the night, and some of the members, including Lou Stokes, got arrested for it. So
No, and I don't mean to focus specifically on the
I'm not
Jewish
blaming, but I
community.
want the record to show that that was the focus and not poultry.
Right.
That's the point. It denigrates the elevation here.
Exactly, and that was the point I was just making to Ambassador
I know,
Sestanovich.
I know.
That it was about, human rights with a special focus on immigration. Does anyone else want to take a shot? Mr. Levin and then Dr. Lozansky, and then I'll yield to my colleague from California, the one to my left, not to the one to my right.
Mr. Chairman, my organization over the years has tried to maintain a clear position of support for the original intention of the amendment. In fact, over many years, there have been numerous attempts by different members of Congress in both parties to expand the scope and definition of the amendment. And it's something that my organization, my membership opposed, because as Ambassador Sestanovich has said, there are many issues that need to be addressed and should be addressed in dealing with Russia's overall human rights record. The beauty of Jackson-Vanik is that while it does talk about the promotion of human rights, it focused on a particular freedom, a freedom that's been expressed for not just in the United States, and not just in the 20th century, but for thousands of years, the right of free movement. And we have lost that focus over the last few years. And just one other point, when we testified in 2002, we talked about the steps that the Bush administration could take, or any administration could take, to ensure that this issue wouldn't be lost and that our other concerns wouldn't be forgotten. And in fact, President Bush wrote a letter to NCSJ talking about assurances that he had received from his counterpart. It's something we can add to the record if you would like. And I think I don't think whether it's NCSJ or broad-based human rights groups, if Russia has graduated, that we're going to forget about these other concerns.
Of course
Let's take care of this. I know the Congress won't, and then continue to press on these other concerns.
I appreciate that, and at the same time, as Mr. Verona points out, I don't want to be in a position to lose jobs for American workers in a time when we need them. And it's clear that, as Mr. Verona pointed out, that Russia is emerging relatively relatively debt-free, and that market that was increasing, and it had been abysmally low, is an opportunity for American commercial interests. Dr. Lozansky.
Well, at least for me, Jackson-Vanik was always about immigration. And I remember when I personally thanked Senator Jackson, we discussed about his amendment. I thanked him personally. And he also, at least in my mind, he thought he talked about immigration. And I wonder what would Scoop Jackson would say now if someone would say that some of us, members of Congress, including, using this as a chicken meat approach to human rights. So many members of Congress are on the record saying that Russia cannot be graduated from Jackson-Vanik until they buy more American chicken. Well, American chicken is great, I love it, and I think we should sell it to Russians, but linking this to Jackson-Vanik, I think it's not very good. But also I want to stress that graduating Russia from Jackson-Vanik, it's not a charity for Russia. First of all, it will cost American taxpayers nothing, but in turn, it will bring great goodwill from Russian people, and I think it will highly increase this reset, which so far we cannot really put a long list of reset achievements. But I can assure you, if we graduated Russia from Jackson-Vanik, this reset list will raise and increase dramatically.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to go to my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Robacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Sherman. I think that giving back these sacred documents and books and papers to Chabad would be a great gesture of goodwill, wouldn't cost anybody anything, and if there's a message that we can give to people who are listening to the other government is, why not do this? This would be a great gesture of goodwill, and I associate myself with Mr. Sherman's remarks, although I do not believe that should hold us up in assessing what Jackson-Vanik is all about. Let us just note that, first of all, in our own country, should Russia be considered a democratic country that's flawed now, or should it be considered still a rogue nation, a lawless nation? We had A lot of Americans don't like to remember this. I lived in North Carolina when I was a young boy, and I remember the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina, even in those days in the 50s. But for at least 70 years, we had a terrorist organization that were murdering people who were trying to organize the right of a group of our fellow citizens to vote. They're murdering black people in order to terrorize them. The judges let them go. The government didn't enforce the law for 70 years in our country's history. Now, was our country a democratic country at that time, or was it a rogue, lawless nation? No, it was a flawed democratic country, and we had our flaws, and we needed to work on it. There are things that Russia now has that are flawed, but it is essentially a democratic country. It should be treated that way. And if they do, we should be working with the forces and who want to help reform that society, and perhaps maybe as we needed to reform our judicial system so that the Ku Klux Klan wasn't running all over the place murdering blacks, maybe we need to make sure we work with Russian people to help them make sure their judiciary system is perfected. I'd like to, Mr. Sater, you made some good points and about some of the flaws that I'm talking about. Do you believe that these same restrictions that you now want to maintain, the Jackson-Vanik restrictions legally maintain, do you think they should be applied to China?
I hesitate to answer questions about China because I haven't studied China the way I've studied Russia.
It doesn't take very much study to understand that there hasn't been any reform in China. I mean, it doesn't take, you don't have to spend 2 days in the library to understand that all of the things you're complaining about with Russia have not been done in China, yet we have a demonstrably more positive relationship towards China than we do towards Russia.
Vietnam? Well, in general terms, I certainly feel that we should work and put pressure on, to the extent that we can, on the Chinese leadership to respect human rights, just as we do in the.
So you would or would not impose?
Just as we should in the case.
Okay, but you would not. You don't know if you would impose this. Let me.
Well, simply I don't feel qualified to give. To give us such a precise.
For all those people who don't feel qualified, let me suggest that they go to Google, and Google Chinese soldier shoots Tibetans at the border, and what you will find is to this day that if Tibetans try to leave Tibet, Chinese snipers will kill them as they are trying to leave Tibet. And there's a picture of that going on right on Google. The contradiction between the way we are treating China, which is the world's worst human rights abuser, and Russia, which has had the most progress in human rights in my lifetime, is staggering. And no wonder it leads some of the people in Russia to doubt our sincerity, the good people in Russia, as well as perhaps the bad people as well. I would, again, suggest that we get 10 minutes left. I am going to have to, I will just suggest, thank you very much for your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I think you've selected a great group of witnesses, and the points you've made I generally agree on, and I listened to what you had to say, Mr. Sater.
Well, thank you.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. Dana, I'm sure if I go to Google, I'll see that picture. I'm also sure that if I was in China and I went on Google, I would not see that picture.
We're in Russia, you would see it.
Yeah. Yes, that Ambassador, you put forward an interesting legislative proposal. I think it's sophisticated, except in one aspect, where you talk about a resolution of disapproval. That's what Congress does when we want to give ourselves the illusion that we have some control while depriving ourselves of all control. A resolution of disapproval, even if it were passed by both houses of Congress, would probably be vetoed by the executive branch, and then would be effective only if we overrid the veto in both houses of Congress. I suggest instead that you provide for expedited consideration of final approval, or simply drop the measure altogether. Expedited approval is when Congress really retains control, and I would think resolution of disapproval is worse than nothing because it gives us the illusion.
Much has been said about Tom Lantos. It is testimony to his status that we are talking about his position. It seems clear that in February of 2007, he was for unconditional removal of Jackson-Vanik from Russia. But in April, and in my opening statement, I specifically said that it was in April of 2007 that he conditioned that on one very modest condition, and that is that the Chabad papers, the Shearson papers, be turned over. And I believe that that was his consistent position from April 2007 until his death almost a year later. Jackson-Vanik was about Soviet Jews. Yes, it covered other groups as well, but it was always interpreted to be Soviet Jews. The people are free to leave Russia, but their sacred documents are still held hostage. I should point out that Lubavitch, the town where the Chabad movement was based, and in fact, it is the Lubavitch rabbi that created these papers, is in the Smolensk region of Russia. And we turned over in 2002, coincidentally perhaps, the Smolensk archives that came into our possession during World War II. And it is regrettable that Russian leaders at that time, having obtained the archives that they had asked for, did not return to the rightful owner the Rebbe's papers. Mr. Levin, the archives, half of the papers I'm talking about, were papers that Stalin allowed to be taken out of the Soviet Union, or at least, I don't know if he was, I doubt he was personally involved, but a government under his control. And yet now, the current government of Russia refuses to allow these documents to leave. Why? Any insight into the Russian position other than, well, there are some Jews in the United States that want these papers, therefore they will not be turned over?
Mr. Sherman, I can't speak for the Russian Federation, nor will I try. But I think you know.
Can you mention any advantage or benefit that Russia obtains by holding these papers?
No, I can't.
Are these a great tourist attraction? Are they treated as important? Are thousands of Russians lining up each day to see these, the way that thousands of Americans line up to see the Liberty Bell?
You should know that for the last 20 years, on and off, but mostly on, NCSJ has worked with the Chabad leadership to try to move this issue forward. Mm-hmm. And we have been on record urging the Russian government to return the library or to work out some sort of arrangement that satisfies both the Chabad and the government. It should also be noted that that there is some controversy within the Chabad community themselves about where the library should reside. I leave that to Chabad to deal with, but make no mistake that our position is very clear. This collection should be in the hands of the rightful owners, the Chabad community, and we continue we will continue to raise this issue at every opportunity. I don't know, and I probably couldn't.
There are only 6 minutes left, so I'll simply conclude with a comment on Mr. Sater's comments, and that is, I think that if Jackson-Vanik is leverage, it should be only something. We should look to something commensurate and relevant. And I'm not sure that in return for Jackson-Vanik being removed, that the people who dominate Russia are likely to take actions that actually imperil their continued governing of the state. and we might want to look for something a little smaller and more relevant to the original purposes of Jackson-Vanik. With that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and let me recognize Mr. Scott of Georgia.
Thank you very much. One of the reasons why I find this particular hearing so vitally important, within about 4 weeks, I have to go give a paper and on the future of Russia, United States, a new partnership. An interesting thing, I'm going over to the Soviet Union to give this paper in Latvia. And our areas of concern are really in the new partnership. How we can work together to keep nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of terrorists, the Iran situation, missile defense, energy security. There's such a plethora of things we've got to work on. So the question is, if this Jackson-Vanik treaty comes up, because this is NATO and we're going to have parliamentary assembly and we're going to have meetings, I want to hear from you all because I've been fascinated with each of your presentations. But I want to be clear in what each of you are saying. So if each of you could just very briefly tell me, in the event it's brought up, which it will be brought up in the discussion, the removal of, or should we say the graduation of Jackson-Vanik, what do we gain by having it repealed or graduated in terms of the future of Russia-United States relations? And what do we gain if we don't repeal it? In other words, back to my first point, to be or not to be, to do or not to do, where is the benefit for the United States either way as we move to establish a new partnership, and the advice you can give me in presenting this paper?
And we have 3 minutes, so we're going to ask each of the panelists very quickly to respond from the Congressman's question. Mr. Verona.
Well, thank you very much. I think we, uphold our own legal traditions. I think when we have a law on the books that is no longer applicable, we remove it, or we remove its applicability to a single individual. I think also if we pass other legislation affecting other countries, other circumstances, attempting to use a form of inducement, if we don't show that we're willing to rescind a law or to graduate a country from the effect of the law when they comply, eventually it erodes any credibility that a future compulsive action would have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Levin?
Mr. Scott, we demonstrate that we fulfill the commitments and the intent of the law, and we demonstrate that when hundreds of thousands of people are able to move freely from a place that they once were not, then it's time to recognize that movement and graduate.
Ambassador?
Congressman, your first step in speaking to a Latvian audience will be not to call it the Soviet Union. You want to say former Soviet Union. And there's even a question.
Thank you for that correction. I appreciate it. I will do that.
The question that will be on the minds of people in your audience is, in repealing or graduating Russia from Jackson-Vanik, are we suggesting that we don't care about things that we used to care about? And not just human rights, but, for example, the defense of our little allies that are on the border of Russia. What your audience will want to hear is that the repeal of Jackson-Vanik is a narrow decision reflecting the law and the solution of a problem that once bothered us, that once limited the rights of Latvians, but that it doesn't mean that the United States is suckered in evaluating and defending its own vital interests.
Thank you. Dr. Lozansky.
Well, I would compare this graduation as removal of the huge irritating splinter from the wound, from the injury, which will create tremendous positive momentum for U.S.-Russian relations and cooperation on all the issues that you just mentioned. I strongly believe in that, and I think that we have to do that as soon as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Talisman.
I think graduation is essential. I think the use of repeal is poison. It's
Thank you.
absolute poison.
Mr. Sutter. Graduation, not repeal. Mr. Satter.
Mr. Scott, I think it's a question of symbolism. Graduation of Russia will not change much, but the refusal to countenance it is a signal to Russia that in fact we don't accept everything that goes on there, that we have objections, we reserve the right to make objections, and that goodwill gestures will be based on their being justified.
I want to thank this panel. It's been outstanding. I'm going to be looking to some of you to assist me in drafting legislation, which I intend to file within the next several weeks, that will deal with the graduation of Russia from the aegis of the amendment. And thank you all so much. We're now adjourned.